It's lesson 15, and we're moving on. We've covered Mormonism, covered Jehovah's Witnesses now. Third and final one we're going to look at is Seventh-day Adventism. Some of you will be familiar with that, some of you may be unfamiliar with that. But Seventh-day Adventism is another movement that falls within the broader category of the Restorationist period of the 19th century USA. Today's objective is just kind of an introductory lesson to get some of the basic details, again, not terribly complex. And then we'll follow the same pattern, obviously, that we've followed before. In the next lesson, we'll look specifically at Ellen G. White, a woman named Ellen G. White, who, well, technically speaking, is one of the co-founders. Kind of the Seventh-day Adventism is not really founded by one singular person, technically. There's a group of them, but Ellen G. White is certainly the preeminent one of them, especially in terms of writings and self-professed prophecies and other such things. So we'll look at her specifically, and then we'll go through their theological beliefs, because there's a different view that we'll see, a different kind of side to the way that our interactions as Christians with Seventh-day Adventism works, as opposed to Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, which is different again, and we'll cover that as we go through a little bit here today, but more in lessons to come. All right, so let's begin. The origins, naturally, of Seventh-day Adventism. Founded in 19th century America, hence why we classify it rightfully here under the Restorationist movement or Restorationist period, like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and various others, during an intense particular period of religious revivalism, which is known specifically as the Second Great Awakening. Okay, to one degree or another, the various different groups fall under the category of what's called the Second Great Awakening, and to understand what that means, we kind of need to understand, well, what was the first? The First Great Awakening is a very well-known period in American history, namely 18th century, the first half, essentially, of the 1700s in the US. So this is colonial America, right, pre-revolutionary America. Struggling significantly from the unwashed masses migrating over from England and from Ireland, although that was largely later on, and various other places of the Scotch-Irish, the North Country, the West Country, etc., who had migrated away, especially those of Puritan eschatology or Puritan theology, escaping from what they saw as tyranny or oppression from the Church of England. That's a whole other complex subject. And arriving in the Americas, keeping in mind that, if you're understandably unfamiliar, convicts were still sent to colonial America. In fact, one of the reasons why Australia was founded was precisely because, of course, the American colonies revolt. They united with each other, the 13 of them, and tell old King George III to get nicked. And then now the United Kingdom has less colonies to send, among other people's, convicts over to. Early 18th century America struggled heavily with public immorality, with not necessarily apostasy per se, but with significant moral degeneracy and crime. Of course, being the early colonial days, this is somewhat natural. It leads to a number of prominent figures in the Americas, particularly and especially figures like George Whitefield and John Wesley, or really the Wesley brothers, but John Wesley. John Wesley himself being the founder of Wesleyanism, or as we know them, the Methodists. Okay, so the Methodist denomination. Anglican priests, Anglican ministers who were itinerantly travelling up and down the Americas, preaching good theology to large swaths of crowds, and later on other theologians would come in their wake. So other theologians as well, prominent theologians of North America at that time, were figures like Jonathan Edwards, who was one of the early presidents of Princeton University, or when it was a theological college at the time, and various other figures. This was the First Great Awakening, or what was just called the Great Awakening, a time of moral and religious revival in America. Didn't last terribly long, but it certainly did during the era that these gentlemen were preaching itinerantly up and down the Atlantic coast of America. The Second Great Awakening, which is what our purview is here, is a subsequent movement that comes along about 100 years later. Now we're into the 19th century, of course, in this context here, and very much attempts to ride the coattails of that movement, right? Hence why it labels itself as the second, it labels itself and is also labelled as the Second Great Awakening. The issue, however, is it was a very, very different movement, very different theologically, born of very different ideas theologically, went in a very different direction than the First Great Awakening. It was certainly named to try and link itself with that movement, religious movement, in early 18th century colonial America, but is the product of the Second Great Awakening, and other such things are things like Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, various other things, right? This is the context, okay? So it's a similar context to what we've been seeing before, but falls under this broader category of the Second Great Awakening, or later we call it at different times other movements like the Restorationist movement. It came on the back, primarily in terms of Seventh-day Adventism, with a figure which to any of us would mean nothing, but actually to a man who was, realistically speaking, probably the single most famous man in America at that time, a gentleman named William Miller, right, who lived from 1782 to 1849. He himself was a minister, clergyman, who had famously, I suppose actually now infamously, predicted an imminent return of Christ. Okay, originally in 1833, later on revised to 1844, of course, both of which failed to come to fruition, and what would become known as the Great Disappointment. Many a newspaper, you can actually read various different news articles from that time period of major publications in New York and Pennsylvania and other such places that described William Miller as more famous than the president. Right? He is alive during this time period when Andrew Jackson, one of the most famous American presidents, is president, and that's saying something. Everyone knew who William Miller was. He was a household name. It would be like mentioning famous celebrities from today's period. In every literal sense, millions and millions and millions of Americans, whether they'd met him or not, heard him preach or not, knew who William Miller was. He was unequivocally the most famous man in 1830s America. And because of these prophecies, and his followers become known as the Millerites. Okay, so I'm just trying to explain a bit about what this point is discussing, because it deeply impacts the foundations. In fact, it's directly impacting the foundations of Seventh-day Adventism. The Millerites are his devotees, and of course, as is often the case, unfortunately and tragically, when these kinds of false prophets arise, is that people tend to kind of go all in with them. And so tens of thousands of Americans, potentially as high as hundreds of thousands actually, but certainly tens of thousands of Americans, American families sold their life, sold their assets, sold their life savings, gave it all to that ministry or gave it away to charity, whatever, blah, blah, and followed him around in itinerant poverty, right? Because of course Christ was returning, it's all about to happen, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't happen in 1833, it then gets revised to 1844 later on, and 1833 is what's primarily referred to as the Great Disappointment, but it's really kind of both of them. It's ultimately then 1844, the Great Disappointment, and that's kind of what news articles in media, American media at the time, would publish, the Great Disappointment, right? The consequence of, and it's ironic that we've been talking about this in Deuteronomy, but the consequence of this guy going unchecked and having millions of people under his charismatic sway, especially those who went to the fullest extreme, which was a minority, but still went to the extreme of selling, their assets and life savings, everything else, devastated people, right? So the collapse of the Millerite movement as a concept was devastating. A group of the disillusioned, right, which constituted millions, decided instead to not just abandon his views, right, because that's what most people did, right? Hence the term Great Disappointment. Various smaller groups decided to actually reinterpret his meaning, okay, as what is very much in hindsight a coping mechanism. Not that they thought of it this way, but that's what it clearly is, right? One such group, okay, which was led by this figure, as I said, Ellen G. White. She wasn't the only one, she was a co-founder, right? Reinterpreted these teachings. Now, I'm not going to go heavily into this because we'll look more at Ellen G. White, the person, in the next lesson, right, which is deeply informative to Seventh-day Adventism. Whilst founded by a group of co-founders, her life and her writings especially, her teachings are central to how the adherents understand the whole thing, right? But her family were Millerites, okay? So Ellen G. White was, I think either 14 or 16, I think 16 when the Great Disappointment happened. Her family was one of those ones that sold everything, right? So her entire future, sustainability, any concept of inheritance, if there was any, all gone down the drain. She's one such person who does the reinterpretation as opposed to abandoning, right? Number of groups do this. In this case, for her and her other co-founders, but through her, she reinterprets the return of Christ to be what is called in SDA, or Seventh-day Adventist theology, the investigative judgment. We're not going to look at that heavily. We'll touch on it a little bit here today, but we'll look more at that in the theology section, okay? So it's not a return of Christ, what they refer to as a return in judgment. So it's a spiritual return, right? Hence, out of this failure of the Millerite movement and the Great Disappointment, which was this huge event in early 19th century America, as we said, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or what from now on I'll just for short call SDA, right? Seventh-day Adventist. SDA was formally started in 1863, okay? So that's the synopsis of its origin. We'll see a bit more of that when we look at Ellen G. White in coming lessons, right? But that's the basic breakdown. It's born of a previous movement which catastrophically fails, right? And the failures of a previous false prophet, William Miller, end up spawning a variety of groups technically, but the most famous of which is the SDA, right? The Seventh-day Adventist Church, or Seventh-day Adventism, okay? So that's the synopsis of the origins. What are its doctrinal distinctives? And we're only going to cover here again. They have a whole host of theological beliefs, more on that in theology lessons, that they agree with us on, okay? So they are Trinitarians, for example. They weren't originally. the original group with Ellen G. White were actually made up mostly of semi-Arians, right? So the ancient Arian heresy, like the Jehovah's Witnesses are, many others were also what we technically class as semi-Arian, okay? So Arians believe that Jesus is a completely distinct divine essence from the Father. That's like the JWs. Semi-Arians is a halfway heresy. It believes that he has a similar essence. I won't bore you with the distinctions between homoousian, homoousian. We've covered this in early church history. But anyway, they do hold, after that time period, including today, standard Trinitarian positions. They believe in the infallibility, or the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture. They have the same canon. They believe that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. They believe that he died, was buried, and raised bodily. Like, there's various beliefs which they hold which are like us. But doctrinal distinctives, so what's distinct from us as Christians, there's kind of 5 at least main ones I just want to touch on here to give you an idea of what on earth is Seventh-day Adventism at all, right? The first 2 are going to be where they actually derive their name from, okay? So Saturday Sabbath, right? SDA insists that the Seventh-day Sabbath, in other words, the Saturday, remains binding on Christians in the New Covenant, okay? Naturally, of course, it features in the Old Covenant directly. Their position, however, is that command has not changed, is that command, obviously in the 4th command, has remained the same in nature, let alone in application, into the New Covenant, right? And there's various reasons why they argue that. It's kind of like what we saw with JW's seemingly plausible arguments that upon further examination fall apart, right? We'll cover that. That's the kind of 7th-day component. The second is then in regard to the second coming, so hence the Advent, right? That's why we, in the Christian calendar, have the period of Advent, right? The 4 Sundays, leading up to Christmas Day, right? Adventus, from the Latin adventus, meaning arrival, okay? So the second coming, or Advent, their position emphasizes as a very central component, literally foundational component of their theology, the imminent, in other words, like about to happen, the imminent visible return of Christ to the earth in a premillennial context. We'll explain more about that in the theology section later on, right? But that's where the Seventh-day Adventist components of their names come from. Kind of like with the Jehovah's Witnesses, we looked at, well, they take it from a particular phrase in the Old Testament about witnesses of the Lord, right? Witnesses of Jehovah. This is where the Seventh-day Adventist name kind of comes in, right? And this is tied particularly and especially, I haven't made point of it here because we'll cover that later, but part of that revelation that Ellen G. White reinterprets is God revealing to her that the church is apostate because it worships on the Sunday. that the Sunday worship, in other words, like what we're doing right now, what we've done today, is actually the mark of the beast in Revelation, and that the return of Christ inaugurated under this investigated judgment a return back to true biblical worship on Saturday. Anyway, cover that in those theology lessons, okay? Third is that concept which I just mentioned, investigated judgment, right? This is a very unique, novel belief, actually, and I do mean that in the sense of unique. It actually is literally unique. No one ever believed that until Ellen G. White kind of conjured it up. Naturally, of course, because she, like others, are choosing to how they're going to cope with the great disappointment from the Millerite collapse, right? And part of this coping mechanism, and by the way, just pause for a second. When you hear me mentioning that this is a coping mechanism, I'm not trying to be insulting to any of the SDA people, right? God bless them. But it is very much a coping, it's a psychological and emotional and spiritual coping mechanism, right? They've had their world shattered. I'm talking about going back to the Millerite disappointment. They've had their world shattered, and especially cases like Ellen G. White as a young 16-year-old woman with her entire life ahead of her, chooses to, instead of accept the fact that the people responsible for her well-being and livelihood, namely her parents and particularly her father, squandered it by rolling the dice on someone who, shock horror, proved to be a false prophet. Instead, it was much easier to reinterpret and end up actually coming out with a new religion, right? This is why I'm using this term, right? But in this case, the investigated judgment is unique to Seventh-day Adventism because Ellen G. White is the genesis of that idea, right? That in 1844, the prophesied events of the return of Christ from William Miller did actually happen, but not in the way that Miller thought it was going to happen, right? Miller was very clear and unambiguous about how it was allegedly supposed to happen, which is the same as everyone else who's ever tried to predict the bodily return of Christ, the second coming, which is he's going to come back and you're going to see him with your own physical eyes. It's not going to be some secret thing. It's reinterpreted to be a period of judgment, right? An advent of judgment, wherein Christ begins. Technically, the belief is that he enters the Holy of Holies in the heavenly temple, right? Mirroring that of the earthly temple of old, and as high priest begins an examination or a judgment of the lives of believers. More on that when we cover it. It's heresy. It has very severe implications for salvation, but we'll cover that, right? These are the three kind of cornerstones, right? There's then two others as well that very much kind of feed into this, right? Annihilationism. Now, we saw this previously with the JWs, right? The JWs began entirely because Charles Taze Russell, their founder, he was born in a Presbyterian household to Scotch-Irish immigrants. They later became Congregational, right? But same, again, similar theology, just different views on church governance. His entire problem began because he had an issue with the concept of eternal judgment or of hell, right? And so he invoked or came through with the development of annihilationism, right? He wasn't the founder necessarily, but he latched onto that heresy. They too also hold that, okay? So they reject what's called a conscious eternal torment, in other words, punishment in hell, right? They believe in what in theological terms would be called the conditional immortality of the soul, okay? It's somewhat unique to them, but not technically. Other heretical groups have believed this every now and then throughout history. The fundamental belief is that the immortality of our spiritual essence or our spiritual nature is conditional upon the gospel, that we will receive that immortality at the day of judgment. Has some implications for our salvation now, but ignore that for the second. And that spiritual essence is by nature not immortal, okay? And they try and tie that back into events in Genesis 3 and being cut off from the tree of life and other such things. Cover that later. Ergo, those who are judged as unrighteous, those who reject Christ, those who reject his salvation, will be annihilated because they won't have immortality, okay? Annihilationism is heresy. It's always been heresy, going back to Scripture. We covered this a bit in the JW section, right? The same language that's used for eternal life is used for the eternal judgment, okay? By nature, they're the same in terms of their eternality, right? More on that anyway. But they hold to an annihilationism. I'm just drawing a commonality between these other restorationist groups. The view of annihilationism became pretty common among these different restorationist groups, not universally, but pretty common among them in the 19th century American context, right? And then finally, and this actually maybe arguably is what they're best known for other than the whole Advent thing, is actually their dietary kind of culture or health views. They view Old Testament, what we call elements of the customary law, right? So the dietary laws, for example, in Leviticus 11 most prominently and elsewhere, as some would say binding, other SDA would say useful but not binding. There's a bit of a disagreement among them, to be honest. We'll cover that when we get to it. But they certainly very much promote it as useful. So in other words, on the flip side, they reject things that are not in conformity with the Old Testament dietary laws. Okay, so they won't eat pork, they won't consume alcohol or tobacco. Most won't consume caffeine as well, although that's a bit of a mixed bag, pardon the pun, in terms of who does and doesn't. But things like that. Okay. They've actually founded many business enterprises along those lines. So the company Kellogg's, for example, was founded by one of the early prominent Seventh-day Adventists in Battle Creek, Michigan. Sanitarium, which is in Australia, New Zealand, elsewhere, so things like Weet-Bix, what else? Up and Go, little Up and Go drink, that's all Sanitarium. Those are all Seventh-day Adventist companies or corporations. Many other things like that. They're very big into healthy, what they would call holistic living, plenty of which is actually totally fine and good, to be honest with you. It gets a bit theologically dicey when it comes to their views on how this works for salvation, but we'll cover that again in those other lessons. But that's a very big thing for them. So health and well-being is a huge component for them. It was a big movement in late 19th century America because this is the era in which teetotalism, so in other words, not just the view of like alcohol in moderation, but like alcohol no bueno, rejection of any alcohol, was starting to come to fruition through 19th century feminist, like first wave feminist movement in America, right? So things like health and other such things is very big for them, right? So, final little bit of an overview, and this will round off our lesson today. Like I said, it's not a complex lesson today. To give you an idea of kind of the big 30,000-foot view of the organisation. These days have about 22 million adherents. They had fairly small numbers up until about World War I. It started to lift a bit, and then from World War II it skyrocketed. Okay, there's a variety of reasons for this. They start engaging in a huge global missionary program after World War II, partly on the back of America's new position as the global hegemon, right, clearly, even in the midst of the Cold War context. America being victorious through the first two world wars, expanding its geopolitical presence into Asia, into Africa, into parts of Europe, obviously, in the Mediterranean. It's had a significant expansion culturally and globally on the back end of that. That's why it happens kind of after World War II. It's active in over 200 countries, right? So actually there's only a handful of countries in the world now, I think about 8 or 10, that don't have at least one Seventh-day Adventist church. You can, if your life was really that boring, you could go on Google Maps and go around any of the random islands of Micronesia or of Polynesia in the Pacific, and you'll almost guaranteed to find at least one Seventh-day Adventist church plonked there on a random island in the Pacific, right? They have a considerable spread, far wider than the JWs, and even realistically speaking, far wider than even the Mormons. Right? They're most heavily concentrated actually in Africa, so sub-Saharan Africa, and South America. That's their two biggest bases. The vast majority of SDA adherents are from Africa and South America these days. Only about 1.2 million Seventh-day Adventists are in the USA proper. Okay, so vast majority are actually outside of the US these days. Their annual conversions are easily the highest of any of these restorationist groups by far. In fact, they even outpace certain Christian denominations, to be honest. They're not as big as Christianity on the whole, obviously, but about 1 million people are baptised into, because they practice baptism like we do, are baptised into the Seventh-day Adventist Church annually, roughly speaking. That's at least their numbers, right? And they also, more distinctly, operate one of the single largest kind of broadly charitable but educational and medical systems in the world. Really the only organisations which have a greater and more expansive network of that would be the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church globally. SDA would have to be third. They might even outpace Anglicans, to be honest, these days. But anyway, the third. They have about 9,000 academic institutions, be they primary schools, secondary schools, universities, colleges, things like that, as well as then many other hospitals and other kind of medical or medical adjacent institutions globally, right? I've listed some of them before, I'll list some of them again here. Kellogg's, Sanitarium Health, Lena Linda Foods, which are not here, we don't have the presence here, but it's big in the US. Their hospitals as well, they have some of the most prolific research hospitals in the US, actually, especially in California. Quite an active organisation, right? So it's not a small thing, 22 million people, largely expansive. You've probably seen, Adventist schools here in Australia, of course, right? This is the organisation. So that's that. All this is designed for just a quick little introductory lesson, right? Origins, which we'll touch on many times over the coming lessons, back in 19th century America, during this same kind of period of the Second Great Awakening, the Restorationist movement, et al. Ellen G. White's the key figure, not the only figure, but the key figure. So slightly different than what we had with Mormonism and the JWs, which is like a singular guy who then becomes the thing which everything else flows forward from. They technically were founded by a group of co-founders, but Ellen G. White, especially for more traditional Seventh-day Adventists, is certainly the lens through which everything else is seen. So it's a similar dynamic to that. We'll look more at her life in the next lesson and following. One thing to keep important, I'll round off with this point, is that, because it's going to be really apparent as we go through this, is that of any of the group, and you might think, why have I chosen these three? Because there are bombloads of other restorationist groups, which some of them don't even have a presence here in Australia, right? Some of them came and went, right? There's a multitude of these things which exploded out of this dumpster fire of a time that was 19th century America, quite frankly. Why these? Like, why Mormonism, JW, Seventh-day Adventists, right? Mormonism because of how obviously distinct it is from Christianity, right? And its prolific size. JWs because of its very specific claims, as well as its deeply evangelistic presence, right? No one does more active, outward, public kind of street evangelism of any of these groups than the JWs. And then this third one, to cover a different category again, is SDA, right? And the reason for choosing it, apart from the fact that it fits in the category, is that both to Seventh-day Adventism, as well as even some, I emphasis on the word some Christians, classifying, my classification, it's not my classification, but my being here and classifying like others have SDA as a restorationist cult or group is controversial. So the reason for that controversy is because if you were to tally up, broadly speaking, a kind of concerted list or an accumulated list of doctrines of whatever particular nature or kind that we consider to be fundamental, SDA aligned with us on probably 90%. Maybe even a little bit more, perhaps, potentially, I don't know. But at least 90%, right? Especially in distinction to things like Mormons or JWs, right? So the Mormons who are complete polytheists, right? Because technically the entire objective of Mormonism is to become a god and populate your own planet. In the case of the JWs, they're just straight down the middle Arians, just like their ancient heretical ancestors, right? So there's nothing complex there. Seventh-day Adventists are Trinitarians. They wrestled with Arianism a bit, but then they abandoned it and went, no, the Bible clearly teaches Trinitarianism, which is true, right? They have many, on the surface they appear to do a lot of the same things. Their church services are actually pretty similar, apart from the fact they're on a different day, right? But what goes on in the service is actually reasonably similar to a degree. They practice communion once a quarter, not what should be going on, but without being smart, a lot of Baptist churches, especially in North America, practice communion once a quarter. In fact, that's the average. The average Baptist church in the USA practices communion 4 times a year, okay? So a lot of things they do are very, very similar to us as Christians. And many famous theologians over the last 100 years have examined SDA and arrived at the conclusion that it's actually a legitimate Protestant denomination, right? The issue, as we're going to see as we unfold through this, is that with the utmost respect to those gentlemen, is that they're wrong. Okay? And I'm not the first person to point out that they're wrong. In fact, a lot of other Christian theologians have also said, no, these things are actually heretical and you can't just hold those things in some loose, tangential sense and then still be considered within Orthodox, faithful, like Catholic Christianity, right? The universal faith, right? So Seventh-day Adventists definitely don't consider themselves to be restorationists. They absolutely consider themselves to be a legitimate Christian denomination. They're not like the JWs who will tell Christians that they're just like them, but then in reality, once you actually peek behind the veil, they're secretly trying to convert you to their thing, right? They straight up and down will tell you and consider that I'm a Christian just like you, right? The vast majority of Seventh-day Adventists will consider us to be Christians, where the JWs technically wouldn't, right? And Mormons definitely wouldn't. Although that depends on how traditional they are, etc., etc. So as we unfold our way, or work our way through this unfolding little mini-series on the Seventh-day Adventists, on SDA, I'm just wanting you to keep that in the back of your mind, right? And I'm going to demonstrate what other theologians and other peers have demonstrated before, which is why they're not a Protestant denomination, they're not a Christian denomination, right? And in fact, they actually hold views which are by definition exclusivistic to them, okay? Because it impacts how one ever interacts with them, right? It's why it's a bit tricky when dealing with SDA, because they very much consider themselves just another Christian denomination, and unfortunately, many Christians who are just not familiar with it, which is totally understandable, don't actually know what SDA believe as a distinctive belief, and so they just generically, in a naive sense, consider them to be Christians as well, right? It doesn't help them if we do that, right, because they're not. It determines whether or not we evangelize them. Well, that's a make or break issue, right? Keep that in mind as we go forward. So that's the lesson, right? Cool. Do you have any questions? Probably not. We haven't really said much, but do you have any questions from the outset or anything that needs clarifying there? If not, all good, because obviously we've got a number of lessons to come. Cool. All right, good.